Every Easter morning, as the pale Swedish sun struggles to thaw a landscape still locked in winter's skeletal grip, a strange and unsettling ritual unfolds. Young children emerge into the weak light, their faces transformed into masks of the uncanny. They wear oversized ragged skirts and floral headscarves, knotted tight under their chins, their cheeks painted with circles of festive red that look uncomfortably like fresh bruising or the first flush of a fever. They carry copper coffee pots and move from door to door, offering handmade drawings in exchange for sweets. To the modern eye, these little Easter witches are a charming remnant of a pastoral past, as benign as the birch twigs decorated with feathers that stand in every window. But beneath this veneer of childhood play lies a spectral history written in blood and ash. This is no mere game. It is a malignant folklore survival of the Great Noise, a decade in the late 17th century when the Swedish kingdom was consumed by a legal frenzy that saw hundreds of innocent neighbours beheaded and fed to the pyre. At the heart of this slaughter was the myth of Blå Jungfrun, a supernatural meadow where the world was turned upside down. Today, we peel back the painted red smiles to reveal the terror of the stake and the ancient cold shadow of the Blue Maiden. Picture a sailor in the year 1600, his hands raw and bleeding from the salt-crusted ropes of a ship navigating the Kalmar Strait. The wind is a low, mournful howl, and the Baltic Sea is a black, heaving void. Suddenly, rising from the mist like the hump of a drowned giant, a massive, smooth dome of granite looms on the horizon. The sailor's heart recoils. He refuses to look directly at it. He knows that to utter the word Blå Jungfrun while at sea is to summon a storm that will tear the hull asunder. Instead, he whispers a euphemism, the Blue Maiden. It is a desperate verbal charm, a way to navigate these waters without provoking the ancient things that dwell upon those barren, blue-toned heights. He steers as far from that granite shore as the currents allow, for he knows this is no mere island. It is a portal. It is the physical anchor for a geography of the damned, a place where the world of men ends and the inverted realm of the malignant begins. Historical archives tell a colder, more geological story, yet one no less chilling. The island of Blå Jungfrun rises 86 metres above the heaving Baltic, a fortress of unique blue-tinted granite that feels alien to the soft, rolling coast of the mainland. It is a place of absolute isolation, devoid of sweet water and inhabited only by the wind. While the rest of Sweden prepares for the rebirth of spring, the island remains a cold, unyielding monument to the dead. It is the quintessential liminal space, a boundary where the veil between our world and the terrifying unknown is permanently frayed. Throughout the 17th century, this island was the focal point of a national obsession. It was believed to exist simultaneously in the physical Baltic and in a spectral dimension, a destination accessible only to those who had traded their souls for the secret of flight. The old chronicles did not treat the island as a metaphor. Olaus Magnus, the last Catholic Archbishop of Sweden, provided a harrowing account in 1555, describing it not as a legend, but as a hideous and cruel destination where all witches were compelled to gather on Maundy Thursday. He wrote of the journey as a physical traversal of a sea that had grown hungry for human spirits. In the common mind of the time, Blå Jungfrun was a shifting nightmare, a floating meadow or a kingdom beneath the waves, but the sight of the actual island in the strait gave these fears a crushing weight. It was a place you could point to from the shore, a constant, looming reminder that the devil was not a far-off prince of darkness, but a neighbour who lived just across the water. In recent years, archaeology has revealed that the island's reputation for high strangeness predates Christian demonology by thousands of years. In 2014, researchers uncovered a ritual history that stretches back 9 millennia. Deep within the island's granite heart, they found evidence of Mesolithic activity, suggesting the Blue Maiden has been a site of esoteric worship since the dawn of man in the north. They discovered 2 primary sites of ritual significance that challenge our understanding of the ancient world. The first is the altar cave, a deep natural crevice in the granite that served as a site for offerings to forgotten deities long before the first church was built. The second is the theatre cave, a massive hollow with tiered rock formations that suggest communal gatherings or ritual performances of an unknown nature. These caves were never shelters for the living. They were cathedrals for the dead, used by ancient people to communicate with the cold forces of the earth and the sea. The 17th century terror of Blå Jungfrun was not an invention of the church, but a lingering echo of a pre-Christian reverence for a place that has always felt separate from the world of men. This sense of separation is most palpable on the southern shore, home to the Trojaborg labyrinth. This stone maze of unknown origin remains the centre of a powerful and modern superstition. Folklore dictates that the labyrinth is a trap for spirits, a way to bind the spectral forces of the island so they cannot follow travellers back to the mainland. No one must ever remove a stone from the island's surface, for to take a piece of the Blue Maiden is to take a piece of its curse. It is believed that the stones are tethered to the island's malignant energy, and any souvenir taken will bring a lifetime of misfortune until it is returned. This is not merely an old wives' tale. It is a documented reality. Every year, local officials receive packages containing granite stones returned by mail, often accompanied by harrowing letters from tourists describing financial ruin, mysterious illnesses, and freak accidents that began the moment they brought a stone home from the island. In the year 2004, the situation became so extreme that over 160 stones were publicly returned to the island by ferry in a formal ceremony intended to lift the perceived curses. The Blue Maiden does not just hold its stones, it holds the minds of those who visit it, forcing them to participate in a ritual of return that mirrors the ancient cycles of the Sabbath. During the 16th and 17th centuries, this landscape provided the raw material for a national hysteria. The island was seen as a fortress of the inverted world, a place where the laws of God and nature were suspended. On Maundy Thursday, the night the church's protection was thought to be at its weakest, the air over the strait was believed to be thick with the rhythmic thrumming of wings as those who had renounced their faith took flight. The sight of the island through the spring mist was a source of profound spiritual anxiety, the visible tip of an invisible iceberg of demonic activity. The physical isolation of the island made it the perfect repository for the social and religious tensions of a nation exhausted by war and famine. In the isolated communities of Sweden, where the word of the pastor was law and the fear of the unknown was a constant companion, the Blue Maiden became the other place. This psychological projection turned a geological landmark into a theatre of the occult. Excavations have uncovered evidence of animal sacrifices and the deliberate burning of woods that do not grow on the island, proving that for millennia, people braved the waterless, dangerous rock specifically to perform acts of high ritual. When the children of the Great Noise began to testify about their journeys to the Blue Hill, they were tapping into a deep, subterranean reservoir of cultural memory that had been nurtured by the stones of the island for 9,000 years. The legend eventually evolved from a sailor's dread into a detailed architectural plan of hell on earth. The island was no longer just a rock. It was a castle of the devil, complete with banquet halls and stables for demonic mounts. The transition from ancient ritual to legal carnage represents one of the most significant shifts in history, marking the moment when the esoteric was weaponized by the state. The National Witchcraft Commission used the geography of Blå Jungfrun as a framework for their interrogations, treating the island as a legal fact, as real as any city. By the time the panic reached its peak, the Blue Maiden was no longer a place of stone and sea. It was a place of testimony and fire. This geography of the damned created a trap for the innocent. If you lived within sight of the island lived within you. The spectral flight to the Sabbath was seen as an act of treason against both the crown and God. The Blue Maiden sat in the strait like a silent judge, its blue granite heights a witness to the hysteria that would soon decimate entire parishes. The naming taboo practiced by the sailors was a futile attempt to keep the darkness at bay. For, as the 17th century progressed, the darkness would not stay on the rock. It followed the stories and the secret names back to the mainland, where the first sparks of the Great Noise were waiting to be struck. To avoid a name is to acknowledge its power. By refusing to say Blå Jungfrun, they were admitting that the island was an active, malignant participant in their lives. The granite was not just rock, it was a living entity with a will to strike. When the trials began, this belief provided the perfect soil for the growth of hysteria. Eventually, the legend of the Blue Maiden became a story of children. The 17th century trials were unique because they did not rely on the confessions of outcasts, but on the terrifying stories told by the youth of the community. These children claimed the island was an inverted paradise, where they were fed at the devil's table, describing the flight over the sea with such sensory detail that the courts were convinced of their truth. The physical presence of the island served as the ultimate corroborating witness. If the island was there, then the horror must be real. Analysis of these testimonies shows a tragic feedback loop between adult anxiety and childhood imagination. Children were interrogated in sessions known as angel chambers, where they were encouraged to reveal the secrets of the Blue Hill. Sensing the adults' desperate need for truth, they provided increasingly fantastic details, turning the silent granite into a nightmare of blood baptisms and demonic feasts. It is a place where sweet water cannot be found, yet 9,000 years of people found a reason to be there. It is a place where the granite turns blue in the twilight, reflecting the colours of the underworld. It is a place where a stone labyrinth sits in silence, collecting the curses of those who dare to disturb it. The Blue Maiden sits in the Kalmar Strait as a reminder that the geography of the damned is not just a map of the mind, but a map of the earth itself. The Great Noise may have faded, but the island that anchored it remains, cold and blue and waiting for the next Maundy Thursday. The records of the Torsåker massacre are a testament to how quickly a landmark can be turned into a scaffold. When 71 people were led to the Witch Mountain to be beheaded and burned, They were being punished for a journey to a place they could see from their windows. The tragedy was that it turned the horizon into a crime scene. As we move deeper into the protocols of the Sabbath and the blood of the 17th century, remember the sailor in the mist, refusing to speak the name. He knew something we have forgotten, that some places are not meant to be visited, and some names are not meant to be said. The story of Blå Jungfrun is one of how we project our deepest fears onto the world around us, and how the world sometimes projects those fears back. The island remains a silent sentinel where the ancient and the modern, the esoteric and the spooky, meet in the blue light of the Baltic. It is the beginning of our journey into the great noise, the shadow that hangs over every red-painted cheek on an Easter morning. For the children of the 17th century, the flight to the Blue Hill was a matter of life and death. For the children of today, it is a game. But the island does not know the difference. It only knows the ritual, the stones, and the long, cold silence of the sea. The curse of the Blue Maiden is a living bridge between the ancient ritualists and our modern digital world. It is a reminder that some boundaries are permanent, and some landscapes are forever haunted by the names we are too afraid to speak. The geography of the damned is not behind us. It is still there, rising from the mist, waiting for the Sabbath to begin again. But geography is only the stage. To understand how a nation lost its mind, we must look closer at the tools of the trade, the secret ointments, the inverted prayers, and the object every Swedish child still carries today without knowing its true, malignant purpose. The air in the bedchamber is thick with the suffocating scent of tallow and unwashed wool. It is Maundy Thursday, the night the world holds its breath, the night the church's armour is traditionally thought to be pierced by the memory of a kiss in a garden. A woman kneels by the hearth, her movements jerky and feverish. She reaches into a hidden niche in the stonework and withdraws a small blackened horn, the medicine horn. Inside is a viscous grey ointment that smells of rancid fat and something metallic, like old blood. With trembling fingers, she greases the handle of a birch rake and the soles of her bare feet. She mutters a prayer, but the words are fractured, spiralling backward into the throat of the dark. Suddenly, the chimney seems to widen, the soot becoming a gateway to the stars. She straddles the rake, and with a rhythmic, sickening thrumming of unseen wings, she is pulled upward. The thatch of her roof disappears, replaced by the cold, biting wind of the upper atmosphere. Below, the lights of the village vanish, and ahead, across the churning black void of the sea, the blue hill begins to glow with an unholy, spectral light. The flight has begun. In the 17th century, this flight was not viewed as a psychological break or a dream induced by hunger. To the Swedish legal system, it was a physical and spiritual traversal of the threshold between the world of men and the chaotic outer realm. Central to every trial during the Great Noise was the description of the ointment and the tool of transport. These were not just stories, they were forensic markers. The medicine horn appeared in hundreds of testimonies as a primary identifier of a witch. If a search of a woman's home revealed a horn of unidentified grease, it was often presented in court as the equivalent of a smoking gun. The origins of this flying ointment were described in terms that still have the power to curdle the blood. During the trials, child witnesses, often under the heavy influence of the angel chambers, testified that the grease was manufactured at the Sabbath itself. They spoke of huge iron cauldrons where the remains of unbaptized infants or changeling children were boiled down until only the essence of their innocence remained. Other accounts claimed the ointment was forged from stolen church bell metal, ground into a powder and mixed with the fat of hanged men. Once the tools were anointed, any object could become a vessel for the flight. A broom and a rake, a wooden pole, and even a neighbour's cow, ridden so hard through the sky that the animal would be found the next morning in its stall, lathered in sweat and trembling with terror. These descriptions are the distorted echoes of much older shamanic practices. In the pre-Christian North, the female seeress, known as the vulva, used a spirit staff to enter a trance state. This staff was a symbolic vehicle for the soul journey. When the 17th century church investigators heard children describe women flying on poles, they were hearing a demonic interpretation of a shamanic ritual that had existed in Scandinavia for millennia. The flight was not a physical movement of the body, but a projection of the soul. Yet in the legal frenzy of the 1670s, the distinction between the astral and the physical was entirely erased. Upon arriving at the Blue Hill, the initiates were not greeted by a monster, but by a figure of jarring and worldly temptation. The Swedish devil of the 1600s was rarely the horned and red-skinned beast of southern European art. Instead, he was often described as a man of high status, frequently referred to as the Little Master. He wore fine and colourful clothing, often blue and black, with silver buckles on his shoes and a hat that cast a permanent shadow over his face. He was a figure of wealth in a time of famine and a figure of authority in a time of social collapse. He stood at the gates of Blå Jungfrun with a massive ledger, waiting for the initiates to strike their names from the Book of God and sign themselves into his service with their own blood. This imagery reveals the profound social anxiety of the era. The devil was not a far-off myth. He was a mirror of the local nobility and the rising merchant class. To the struggling peasants of Dalarna and Torsåker, the greatest temptation was not fire and brimstone. It was fine fabric, enough food to eat, and a sense of belonging in a world that felt increasingly hostile. The Sabbath was framed as an inverted world where the social and religious order was flipped upside down. It was a space where the marginalized could imagine themselves as powerful, and the powerless could imagine themselves as part of a secret and dark aristocracy. Inside the halls of Blå Jungfrun, the law of inversion ruled every action. The Sabbath was a dark parody of the holy service. The participants did not sit facing the front. They sat with their backs to the table. They did not dance in a circle facing inward. They danced back to back, their heels clicking in a rhythmic and discordant frenzy. When they prayed, they spoke the Lord's Prayer backward, a linguistic ritual intended to unwind the fabric of creation. The devil himself would stand at a makeshift pulpit, delivering sermons that mocked the local pastors, baptizing children not in water, but in a thick and dark fluid that smelled of iron and earth. The feast at the Sabbath was the ultimate inversion of the Holy Communion. Child witnesses, pressured to describe the wickedness they had seen, spoke of a banquet that was both lavish and revolting. They described silver platters piled high with the troll butter, a yellow slime that we now know as a common woodland fungus, but which they believed to be the excrement of witches' familiars. They spoke of eating toads and snakes and bread made of sawdust and bone meal. This banquet served a specific legal purpose. It proved that the accused had physically partaken in the devil's hospitality, making their betrayal of Christ absolute. The descriptions of the food at Blå Jungfrun often mirrored the actual diet of the starving Swedish peasantry during the Little Ice Age of the 17th century, when children described eating bread that turned to ash in the mouth. They were describing the reality of the bark bread and famine foods they were forced to eat at home. The Sabbath was a nightmare world, built from the materials of their everyday suffering, a place where even a feast was just another form of torment. One of the most persistent and spooky elements of the Sabbath protocol was the creation of the pyres, or the milk hare. The pyres was a magical familiar, a construct made of yarn and hair and a few drops of the witch's own blood. Once brought to life by a demonic whisper, the pyres would run to neighbouring farms and suck the milk from the cows, returning to vomit the stolen bounty into the witch's churn. In the law, to find a pyres was to find the physical proof of a pact. They were described as hopping and limping things that moved with an unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with a malignant intelligence. In the courtroom, the pyres was a powerful tool for the prosecution. Any sudden drop in a neighbour's milk production or a mysterious illness in the livestock could be blamed on a milk hare sent from a nearby house. This created a climate of paranoid vigilance. Every shadow in the barn and every strange bunch of yarn found in a drawer became a potential demonic agent. The esoteric had become a weapon of neighbour against neighbour. The protocol of the Sabbath provided a complete explanatory framework for all the misfortunes of rural life, turning a bad harvest into a cosmic battle. As the night of the Sabbath drew to a close, the little master would reward his followers with gifts that were as illusory as the feast. He would give them coins that turned into dry leaves by morning, or jewels that were nothing more than shiny pebbles. The return flight was a desperate race against the sun. If a witch was not back in her bed before the first cock crow, the spell would break, and she would fall from the sky like a stone. The lore is filled with tales of women found dead in the fields on Good Friday morning, their bodies broken as if they had fallen from a great height, and their skin still smelling of the sulphurous winds of Blå Jungfrun. These false stories likely served as a warning to those who might be tempted by the freedom of the Sabbath. The protocol was a trap. You could fly and you could feast and you could dance, but the price was your soul and, eventually, your life. The 17th century authorities used these stories to illustrate the unreliability of the devil. He was a liar who gave stones instead of bread. By emphasizing the inverted and false nature of the Sabbath, the Church and the state reinforced the idea that the only safety lay in absolute obedience to the Lutheran crown. The protocol was also a tool for social control. By defining the Sabbath as a place where women took the roles of men and children were treated as adults, the authorities were highlighting what they saw as the dangerous breakdown of the patriarchal order. The fear of Blå Jungfrun was, at its heart, a fear of a world where the traditional hierarchy had collapsed. The great noise was the sound of that hierarchy trying to reassert itself through the blood of the accused. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Sabbath protocol was the mark. It was believed that the devil would brand his followers with a secret sign, a spot on the skin that was insensitive to pain and would not bleed when pricked. This mark, sometimes called the devil's finger, was the ultimate proof of ownership. During the trials, specialized witch prickers were employed to strip the accused and search every inch of their bodies for these signs. A birthmark, or a scar, or even a patch of dry skin could be the death warrant. The water test and the pricking of the mark were the physical manifestations of the Sabbath protocol in the human world. They were the methods used to drag the spectral into the material. If a woman was believed to have flown to Blå Jungfrun, her body was no longer her own. It was a map of her crimes. The inversion of the Sabbath was met with the intrusion of the law. The privacy of the home and the sanctity of the body were stripped away in the name of saving the community from the Blue Hill. Today, we see the remnants of these protocols everywhere, though we choose to see them as whimsical rather than wicked. We carry vessels that mimic the medicine horn, and we decorate our homes with the very birch twigs that were once thought to be greased with the fat of the dead. But the great noise has been hushed, and the flight to Blå Jungfrun is no longer a physical journey. It remains a cultural one, a folklore survival that connects the modern suburbs to the iron-grey winds of the 17th century Baltic. The flight to the Blue Hill was a promise of escape. In a world of cold and hunger, the idea of a secret meadow where you could dance with the master was a powerful drug. But as the sun rose on Good Friday, the promise always evaporated, leaving nothing but the smell of smoke and the sound of the executioner's bell. The protocol was a cycle of hope and horror, a spectral trap that was about to be sprung on a massive scale as the hysteria moved from the lore of the bedchamber into the reality of the parish square. The rules of the Sabbath allowed a society to systematically destroy its own members. By defining the enemy with such sensory and ritualistic detail, the authorities made the invisible threat of witchcraft visible. They turned the liminal into the literal, and in doing so, they prepared the way for the bloodiest chapter in Swedish history. The flight to Blå Jungfrun was about to end in the fires of Torsåker. The great noise was about to become a scream. In the high summer of 1668, the air in the remote valley of Älvdalen was thick with the scent of pine and the heavy, humid promise of a storm. A 12-year-old shepherd girl named Gertrud Svensdotter stood by the banks of the Dalälven River, watching her father's sheep. The silence was broken by a whisper from another child, a boy who claimed he saw Gertrud doing the impossible. He watched as she walked across the surface of the water, her feet barely skimming the ripples, as she led her flock to a greener pasture on the far bank. It was a flicker of childhood imagination, perhaps a trick of the shifting mountain light, but in the brittle atmosphere of 17th century Sweden, it was a spark dropped into a powder keg. The whisper began to grow. It became a low, persistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards of every home in the valley. It was the birth of a sound that would eventually drown out all reason. A sound the history books call Det stora oväsendet, the great noise. This was not a single explosion of violence, but a slow and methodical descent into collective madness. The epicenter was the parish of Älvdalen in the province of Dalarna. The local pastor, Lars Elvius, was a man of stern and unyielding faith who saw the hand of the adversary in every shadow. When the rumours about Gertrud reached his ears, he did not see a child's game. He saw a breach in the spiritual wall of his community. He brought Gertrud into the cold and dim interior of the church, and under the crushing weight of his interrogation, the girl's story began to transform. She confessed that she had not walked on water by her own power. She claimed she had been taught the dark arts by a neighbour's maid, a woman known as Big Merit. The legend of Big Merit provides a chilling look at how a reputation could become a death sentence. She was a woman who lived on the margins, a servant who did not fit the narrow mould of the perfect Lutheran subject. Gertrud's testimony against her was vivid and sensory. She claimed that Mere had led her into the barn on a moonless night, greased a calf with a shimmering and grey ointment, and together they had ridden the animal through the air, straight through the chimney and across the peaks of the mountains to the Blue Hill. This was the first time the protocol of the Sabbath was formally entered into a Swedish court record. It was the moment the spectral flight became a legal fact. Merit maintained her innocence with a ferocity that unsettled her accusers. Even when faced with the tearful testimony of a child she had once befriended, she refused to provide the confession the court so desperately craved. But, in the climate of 1668, silence was not seen as innocence. It was seen as the ultimate proof of a hardened heart. The court found her guilty, not based on physical evidence, but on the perceived spiritual purity of her accuser. Her execution on May 19, 1669, was the first tolling of a bell that would soon ring across the entire kingdom. The panic spread like a malignant fever, following the trade routes and the whispers of travellers. From Älvdalen, the hysteria moved to the neighbouring parish of Mora. By the summer of 1669, the great noise had reached a deafening volume. In a single mass execution in Mora, 17 people were led to the pyre, while 60 more were held in chains, awaiting their turn. The fear was no longer about a single woman in a barn. It was about an invisible army of the night that was stealing the children of Sweden while they slept. Every home became a fortress, and every neighbour a spy. The chronology of the panic reveals a terrifying geographical expansion. In the years that followed, the frenzy moved steadily northward into the province of Härjedalen. In the small village of Lillhärdal, 30 more people were executed for the crime of kidnapping children. Initially, the Swedish crown had required a confession or multiple adult witnesses for a death sentence. But as the great noise grew louder, the authorities in Stockholm felt the pressure to act. They established a National Witchcraft Commission, a mobile tribunal of judges and theologians tasked with purging the land of the demonic. By 1674, the standards of evidence had been lowered to a level that made defence impossible. The commission officially authorised the use of torture to extract confessions, and the unwavering testimony of children was now considered sufficient for a death sentence. The law had essentially abandoned the adult world and handed the keys of justice to the very young. This was the birth of the angel chambers, sessions where groups of children were gathered in the presence of the powerful and encouraged to dream out loud. The more fantastic and horrific their stories, the more they were praised as vessels of truth. In the year 1675, the great noise found its most zealous architect in Laurentius Horneus, the assistant minister of the parish of Torsåker. Horneus believed that the end of the world was at hand, and that the devil had made Torsåker his primary stronghold. He employed 2 teenage boys, known as the Nordingrå boys, or the Wise Boys, who claimed they possessed a spectral sight. They told the terrified parishioners that they could see the devil's mark on the foreheads of the witches, a sign invisible to ordinary eyes, proving that the person had attended the Sabbath at Blå Jungfrun. Imagine the scene at the Torsåker church on a Sunday morning. The congregation stands in the cold, thin light of the sanctuary, their breath misting in the air. At the door stand the Nordingrå boys, their eyes scanning the faces of their elders. With a single trembling finger, a boy points to a mother of 4, then to a grandmother, then to a young girl barely older than himself. In that moment, the social fabric of the parish is torn apart. The boys were paid by the parish for their services, a detail that adds a layer of cold and calculated greed to the spiritual frenzy. Any personal grudge or social eccentricity was now a potential mark of the devil. The interrogations in Torsåker reached a level of psychological cruelty that is difficult to fathom. Horneus and his associates did not just use the whip and the water test. They used the most primal fears of their victims. They allegedly threatened to bake the children of the accused in massive stone ovens if the mothers did not confess to taking them to the Blue Hill. Faced with the image of their children's agonizing deaths, many women broke. They provided the court with the exact stories the protocol required, tales of flight and demonic pacts, just to spare their families from the fire. They were confessing to fantasies to escape a reality that had become far more terrifying than any nightmare. The climax of this local madness occurred on June 1st, 1675. It was a day of blood that would leave the parish decimated. After a final sermon in the church, 71 people, 65 women, 2 men, and 4 boys were led in a long and silent procession to the Haxberget, the Witch Mountain. Some of the condemned were so broken by months of torture and imprisonment that they had to be carried by their own relatives to the place of execution. They were beheaded in full view of their neighbours and their remaining families, and their bodies were cast into the pyres. This single event wiped out approximately 20% of the female population of the region. The great noise had become a physical weight, a literal mountain of ash. The names of the dead at Torsuka read like a census of a dying community. There was Merit in Ness, a 60-year-old mother accused of making a familiar from her own blood. There was Halt Karin, a disabled maid, whose physical limp was presented as the mark of a curse. There was Ella in Norum, who was executed alongside her 2 young sons. These were the familiar faces of the village, transformed into spectral enemies by the power of a whisper and the zeal of a fanatic. The executions were technically illegal, yet in the frenzy of 1675, the law was whatever the man with the Bible said it was. The hysteria eventually made its way to the heart of the kingdom, the capital city of Stockholm. It was brought there by a young man named Johan Johansson, known as the Gavel Boy, who claimed his own mother was a witch. In the capital, the trials claimed the life of Malin Matsdotter, a woman of such iron will that she refused to confess even under the threat of death. She was the only woman in the Swedish trials to be burned alive without the mercy of being beheaded first. Her silent defiance in the face of the fire was a jarring contrast to the screaming children who had sent her there. But the death of Malin Matsdotter marked the beginning of the end. Shortly after her execution, the cracks in the great noise began to show. A young child witness confessed to a member of the Witchcraft Commission that he'd made it all up. He admitted that the stories of the Blue Hill were fantasies he and the other children had shared to gain status and attention. This admission caused a domino effect of retractions. Child after child confessed that they had never seen the devil and had never flown through the chimney. The collapse of the great noise was as swift as its rise. The legal system began to arrest the child accusers for perjury. The very children who had been hailed as vessels of truth were now led to the gallows themselves. The great noise ended not with a religious awakening, but with a grim realization that the kingdom had allowed itself to be led to the slaughter by the imagination of its youth. By 1676, the pyres were cold, but the silence that followed was even more haunting than the noise. Easter today is a season of light and candy, but we must remember that it was once a season of paranoid vigilance. Every cute tradition of the modern holiday is a folklore survival of this period of blood. The birch twigs were once used for flagellation. The red-painted cheeks of the children are a mask over the faces of the accusers who once held the power of life and death in their hands. The great noise has faded into a whisper, but it serves as a warning of what happens when we let our fears turn our neighbours into monsters. The Witch Mountain in Torsorka still stands, a silent monument to the 71 souls who were consumed by the hysteria. The wind that blows through the pines there still carries the echo of the great noise. It is a reminder that the boundary between order and chaos is thinner than we like to think. As we move closer to the esoteric roots of the Sabbath and the shamanic origins of the flight, keep your eyes on the children. For in the 17th century, the children were the eyes of the law, and what they saw was a world that deserved to burn. The room is small and cold, illuminated only by a single guttering candle that casts long, jerking shadows against the lime-washed walls. At the centre sits a child, perhaps no more than 6 or 7 years old, her feet dangling inches above the floor. She's surrounded by men in black, pastors and judges and clerks, their eyes heavy with a desperate, hungry expectation. They do not ask if she was stolen in the night. They ask what the devil fed her at the Blue Hill. They ask if her mother greased the broomstick with the fat of a neighbour's infant. The silence in the room is a heavy, malignant thing, pressing down on the child until the boundary between what she dreamed and what she must say begins to dissolve. She sees the approval in their eyes when she mentions the iron brushes and the blood. She realises that her words have a weight that can move mountains and build pyres. And so, with a voice that is small and spectral, she begins to weave a nightmare that will consume her own family. The most disturbing element of the great noise was the role played by the very young. Unlike the witch trials in other parts of Europe or the infamous events in Salem, where the accusers were often teenage girls, the Swedish hysteria relied almost exclusively on the testimonies of children. In the courtrooms of the 1670s, witnesses as young as 5 years old were brought forward to testify against their parents and their grandparents. These children were both the primary accusers and the perceived victims of the Sabbath, a dual role that created a psychological trap of unimaginable cruelty. They were the eyes of the law in a world that had gone blind with fear. To extract these testimonies, the church and the state utilised sessions known as angel chambers. These were not interrogations in the sense we might understand them today. They were sessions of guided fantasy and high-pressure suggestion. The village children were gathered together and encouraged to reveal the secrets of their nocturnal abductions. In these rooms, a child who remained silent was often treated with suspicion or threatened with the whip, while a child who provided the most vivid and horrific details was rewarded with attention and praise. This created a social contagion. Sensing the adults' desperate desire for a specific kind of truth, the children began to compete with one another to provide more fantastic and terrifying stories. The truth of the Sabbath was a collaborative fiction. They described being turned into ravens and flying over the rooftops. They spoke of seeing their mothers milk the devil's fingers to produce a black, bitter liquid. They told stories of neighbours being combed with iron brushes that pulled the skin from their bodies in long, bloody ribbons. These were not the narratives of children who had seen evil. These were the narratives of children who had learned that horror was the only currency that bought safety. The descriptions provided by these young witnesses were a chaotic mixture of Lutheran demonology and distorted local folklore. They spoke of the little master and his fine blue clothing, of the backwoods prayers, and of the banquet of toads and troll butter. But they also included details that revealed the underlying trauma of their own lives. They spoke of the devil's mark and the medicine horn with a level of sensory precision that made it impossible for the judges to believe they were lying. The authorities failed to realise that the children were simply mirroring the fears the adults had been whispering in their presence for years. The psychological dynamic created a horrific and inescapable choice for the children. While they were considered abducted, and therefore victims, their participation in the Sabbath was viewed as a spiritual crime that required a ritual cleansing. In the town of Mora, 148 children were sentenced to run the gauntlet or be whipped by their own parents in front of the church doors. This was the ultimate inversion of the parental bond. A child was forced to denounce their mother to escape the whipping post, only to watch that same mother be led to the pyre as a direct result of their words. As the great noise moved into its most frantic phase, the role of the children became increasingly professionalised. Figures like the Gävleborg in Stockholm or the Nordingrå boys in Torsåker were essentially professional accusers. They were paid by the parishes to identify the marked among the congregation. They stood at the church doors like spectral gatekeepers, their presence a constant threat. These boys possessed a social power that no child should ever hold, the power to decide who lived and who burned. They were the celebrities of the panic, their every word recorded and analysed as if it were scripture. The witnesses of the void also described a version of Blåkulla that was strangely domestic. They spoke of the devil's children and the marriages that took place at the Sabbath. This suggests that the children were projecting their own social structures onto the supernatural realm. The Sabbath was a dark reflection of the village itself, a place where the hierarchies were flipped, but the faces remained the same. This made the testimonies even more convincing to the judges. If the children described the Sabbath as a place with a kitchen and a stable and a nursery, it felt grounded and real. The brutality of the executions was often preceded by a final confrontation between the child and the accused. In many cases, the mothers would beg their children to recant, to tell the truth and save their lives. But the children, trapped by their own stories and the watchful eyes of the pastors, almost never broke. To recant was to admit to a lie, and in the 17th century, a lying witness was often treated with the same severity as a witch. The children were as much prisoners of the great noise as the women in the chains. They were riding a wave of hysteria that they could no longer control. The collapse of the great noise in 1676 was triggered by the very thing that had sustained it: the words of a child. In Stockholm, after the iron-willed Malin Matsdotter had been consumed by the flames, the cracks in the collective dream finally began to widen. A young boy who had been a key witness confessed that he had never been to the Blue Hill. He admitted that the stories were a game, a way to gain importance in a world that usually ignored him. This single confession acted like a stone thrown into a mirror, shattering the consensus. The aftermath for the child witnesses was as grim as the trials themselves. Once the legal authorities realized they had been misled by the fantasies of the young, their reaction was swift and merciless. Several of the primary child accusers were arrested for perjury and sentenced to death. The great noise ended with a final round of executions, but this time it was the accusers who were led to the gallows. The kingdom was attempting to wash the blood from its hands by sacrificing the children it had previously corrupted. This period of history leaves us with a haunting question about the nature of memory and truth. The children of the 1670s were products of a society that had lost its orientation. When we look at the modern Swedish Easter and see the children in their headscarves and painted cheeks, we are seeing the sanitized ghost of these child accusers. We have turned the witnesses of the void into symbols of spring and innocence, effectively burying the trauma of the angel chambers beneath a mountain of candy and colourful feathers. We allow our children to dress as the very figures that once sent their ancestors to the stake, perhaps as a way to tame the memory. But for the historian, the cute tradition is a chilling reminder of a time when a child's imagination was a lethal weapon. The painted red cheeks of today are the echoes of the feverish flush seen in the courtrooms of 300 years ago. The great noise was the sound of a generation of children screaming for attention in a world that only listened to them when they spoke of the devil. It was a failure of the adult world to protect the young from the malignant power of their own fears. As we prepare for another Easter, we must look past the masks and the copper pots and remember the children of Torsåker and Mora. They were the primary victims of the Sabbath myth, forced to sacrifice their humanity and their families to satisfy the spiritual appetites of a society in the throes of a frenzy. The flight to Blå was a journey that began in the eyes of a child. It was a journey into a world where the truth was whatever the powerful wanted it to be. The silence that followed the great noise was the silence of a generation that had seen too much and said too much. A generation that had been forced to look into the void and call it by its name. But what were they actually seeing? Was it pure fantasy, or were they tapping into something much older than the church? To find the answer, we must descend beneath the pyres and into the blue shadows of the ancient north. Close your eyes and move backward through the centuries, past the church steeples and the smoking pyres, until the sound of the bell is replaced by the rhythmic thrumming of a drum. The air here is not thick with the smell of the stake, but with the sharp scent of crushed juniper and the heavy musk of animal skins. A figure sits by a fire that has burned for 10,000 years. She is the vulva, the seeress of the old world, and she holds a staff of iron and wood, known as the gandur. As she chants, her eyes roll back into her head, revealing only the white of the void. She is not falling into sleep. She is preparing to leave. With a sudden, violent jerk, her spirit is torn from her flesh, pulled upward into the freezing, celestial winds. She is no longer a woman of the village. She is a traveller of the hidden paths. She flies not to a demonic feast, but to the roots of the world tree, her soul navigating the spaces between the stars. This is the oldest flight in the north, a journey that began long before the word witch was ever whispered in a courtroom. To the modern mind, the stories of Blå seem like nothing more than the frantic fictions of a persecuted people, but the historian of the esoteric sees something far more ancient lurking beneath the surface of the trials. The concept of the soul journey to a hidden mountain did not originate with the 17th century church. It was a deeply embedded ancestral cultural memory, a distorted echo of pre-Christian Scandinavian and Saami shamanism. The flight to the Blue Hill was not an invention of the Great Noise. It was the reclassification of a ritual that had been practiced in the dark forests and the frozen tundras for millennia. In Old Norse culture, the practice of Sida was a form of ecstatic magic, performed primarily by female practitioners. Sida involved the projection of the soul, a state where the practitioner's mind would detach from the physical body to travel through the spirit world. This out-of-body travel is the direct ancestor of the witch's flight. The tools of the ancient vulva mirror the tools of the accused with a chilling precision. The vulva carried her gandur, a staff or spirit wand that was linguistically and symbolically linked to the spirit helper. When investigators heard children describe women flying on poles and rakes, they were hearing a Christianized, malignant interpretation of the shamanic staff, the original vehicle for the astral journey. The influence of the indigenous Sami people also haunts the legend of Blå. The Sami Noaidi, or shaman, utilized a drum to enter a deep trance, during which their soul would climb the world tree or descend into the underworld to communicate with the dead. Scholars have noted that the very topography of the Sabbath, the journey across a great churning sea to a mountain at the edge of the world, matches the ancient descriptions of the Saami and Norse underworlds. These were places of cold and shadow, realms that existed in a state of permanent twilight. Perhaps the most revelatory connection lies in the name itself. Blå, the Blue Hill, is not just a reference to the colour of the granite on the island of the Blue Maiden. In the old mythology, the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki, presided over the realm of the dead. Her physical form was described as being half flesh and half blue, a dual nature reflecting the boundary between the living and the departed. Her kingdom was a place of blue and grey shadows, a colour scheme that perfectly reflects the spectral light described by those who claimed to have visited the Sabbath. The transition to Christianity did not erase these deep-seated beliefs. It merely renamed them. The shamanic traveller was rebranded as a malignant witch, the spirit world was remapped as a demonic playground, and the ancient goddess of the dead was replaced by the Little Master. This esoteric history suggests that the Great Noise was, in part, a violent collision between two different ways of understanding the soul. The Lutheran authorities saw the flight to Blå as a physical act of treason, a literal movement of the body through the air. But for the people of the countryside, whose traditions were still steeped in the survival of the old ways, the flight was something far more fluid and spectral. It was a remnant of the ecstatic trance, a memory of a time when the mind was free to wander the northern night. The tragedy of the 1670s was that the law could not tolerate a soul that moved outside of its control. The descriptions of the feast at the Sabbath also take on a new, spooky significance when viewed through the lens of ancient ritual. The banquet of toads and inverted prayers was a dark reflection of the communal feasts of the pre-Christian era. In the Old World, ritual eating was a way to bind the community to the gods and the land. By turning the Sabbath feast into something revolting and demonic, the Church was effectively poisoning the cultural memory of those ancient gatherings. Even the pyres, or the milk hare, has roots in this shamanic past. In the old traditions, a practitioner could create a fetch or a spirit double to perform tasks at a distance. This was a form of externalized soul power. During the trials, this esoteric concept was stripped of its spiritual context and turned into a malignant tool of theft. The milk hare was the shamanic spirit helper transformed into a demonic parasite. It is a perfect example of how the Great Noise took the fragments of a broken mythology and weaponized them against the very people who still carried those traditions in their bones. When we consider the modern Easter witch, these esoteric roots become even more apparent. We see children carrying birch twigs and copper pots, unaware they are handling the symbols of a shamanic heritage. The birch has always been a sacred tree in the north, associated with purification. In the 17th century, these twigs were used for the flagellation of the flesh, a ritual of suffering. But in the older world, they were used to beat the bounds and drive away the spirits of winter. The modern postcris is a sanitized, feathered survivor of a ritual that once moved between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Great Noise was not just a legal frenzy, it was a spiritual cleansing, an attempt by the state to finally kill the last remnants of northern shamanism. By labeling the soul journey as a demonic flight, the authorities were attempting to close the doors to the other world forever. They wanted a world that was fixed and literal, where the only path to the divine was through the church and the crown. But the folklore proved to be more resilient than the fire. The old beliefs did not vanish. They went underground, hiding beneath the surface of the new religion and eventually re-emerging in the whimsical masks of a spring holiday. As the sun sets on another Maundy Thursday, the boundary between the worlds remains as thin as it was in the days of the vulva. The flight to the Blue Hill is still happening, though we have forgotten how to see it. It is there in the way we decorate our homes and the stories we tell our children. We are the descendants of a culture that once knew how to fly, and then burned the people who remembered the way. The blue-fleshed goddess of the dead and the shaman on the spirit staff are the silent ancestors of the little girl in the headscarf. When she knocks on your door and asks for candy, she is not just a child playing a game. She is a spectral messenger from a time before the stake, a living reminder of a history that is both more horrific and more fascinating than we dare to imagine. The Blue Hill is still calling, and the flight to the Sabbath is a journey that never truly ends. But as the fear of the stake began to fade into the Enlightenment, the terror of Blå did not disappear. It evolved. It moved from the courtroom into the streets, taking on a new, rowdy form that would haunt the 19th century with a different kind of darkness. A heavy, wet snow falls over the jagged coast of western Sweden in the middle of the 19th century. Inside a small, isolated farmhouse, an elderly couple sits huddled near the dying embers of the hearth. It is Maundy Thursday, a night that still tastes of iron and old secrets in the mouths of the aged. Suddenly, the silence is shattered. There is a violent, splintering crash as a heavy wooden log is hurled through the window, skidding across the floorboards in a shower of glass and winter chill. Before the old man can reach the door, a chorus of otherworldly shrieks and howls erupts from the darkness. The sound of caterwauling cats, distorted and human, vibrating with a malignant joy. When he finally steps into the night, he finds no demons, only the fading footprints of figures in hideous rags and the sharp, lingering smell of soot. On the log lies a scrap of paper, decorated with crude, demonic symbols, and a verse inviting him to join the Black Sabbath at the Blue Hill. He trembles as he picks it up. He knows it is the work of the village youth, yet in the marrow of his bones, he feels the weight of a history that refuses to stay buried. The mask is being worn again, and the terror it evokes is very, very real. By the early 1800s, the pyres of the Great Noise had been cold for over a century. The legal system had long since turned its back on the prosecution of witches, and the Enlightenment had supposedly swept the shadows from the Swedish mind. But folklore survival is a persistent and spectral thing. It does not vanish, it merely changes its shape. In the 19th century, the myth of Blå underwent a strange and disturbing transformation. It shifted from a legal reality into a form of accepted revolt, a dark carnival where the youth used the imagery of the witch to mock and terrorize the adult world. This was the era of the scary Easter, a time when the holiday was not for toddlers seeking candy, but for young adults seeking to unleash the chaos of the inverted world. In this period, the figure of the påskkärring, the Easter witch, was something truly hideous to behold. These were not the sweet grandmotherly figures seen on modern postcards. These were teenagers dressed in filthy, oversized rags and tattered shawls, their goal being to look as unnatural as possible. They wore the skropukansikte, grotesque masks fashioned from stiffened paper or heavy fabric, with eyebrows made of thick forest moss and skin blackened with layers of soot and grease. They were the physical manifestation of the soot-stained travellers who had once been accused of flying through the chimney. This was a time of absolute gender reversal, a lingering echo of the Sabbath's law of inversion. Young men would dress as ancient, withered hags, while young women transformed themselves into trolls or old men with soot-smudged beards. They moved through the villages in roving, unruly bands, their identities hidden behind their hideous masks. They did not walk. They moved with a liminal, hopping gait, specifically imitating the limp of the devil or the erratic movements of the milk hare. For one night, they were the spectral guests of Easter Eve, and they owned the streets. The oral terror of these groups was a key component of the ritual. As they prowled from house to house, they would emit rhythmic shrieks and caterwauling cries intended to mimic the witches' familiars. In the silence of a 19th century rural night, the sound was jarring and invasive. It was the sound of the great noise returning as a mockery. They would overturn carts in the farmyards, release livestock, and pour water over horses to create the impression that the real witches had returned to ride the animals hard through the night. It was a form of ritualized vandalism that forced the community to acknowledge the presence of the spooky. The log-throwing ritual was the most aggressive element of this 19th century tradition. It was a startling act of domestic invasion, approaching a house in silence, then suddenly hurling a log into the living quarters before fleeing. The anonymous Easter letters attached to these logs were not friendly greeting cards. They were frighteningly personal invitations to join the devil at Blå Jungfrun, decorated with drawings of pitchforks and verses that mocked the recipient's faith. The letter was a summons from the void, a reminder that they were being watched by the dark. The older generation was genuinely vulnerable to this harassment. Many who had been born in the late 1700s still harboured a residual ancestral belief in the reality of the Sabbath. They lived in the shadow of their grandparents' stories of the beheadings at Torsåker. When a hideous, soot-faced figure appeared at their window, the fear they felt was not theatrical. It was a primal folklore survival. They dared not complain to the authorities, fearing that if they insulted the witches, they would suffer genuine misfortune in the coming year. The mockery was powerful precisely because the original terror had never truly been forgotten. This dark Easter served as a pressure valve for a society that was still deeply religious and hierarchical. By wearing the mask of the witch, the 19th century Swede was reclaiming a history of trauma and turning it into a tool of social power. They were becoming the monsters their ancestors had burned. The transition from this rowdy, adult terror to the sanitized childhood tradition we see today only began in the late Victorian era, led by the rising middle class and the influence of popular art. Figures like the artist Jenny Nyström began to produce postcards that reimagined the Easter witch. In Nyström's world, the påskkärring was no longer a soot-smeared teenager hurling logs. She was a sweet, smiling grandmother in a colourful scarf, accompanied by a friendly black cat. These mass-produced images were immensely popular and helped to divorce the tradition from its bloody roots. The hideous mask was replaced by the cute face, and the summons to hell became a request for candy. However, the tools of the ritual remained. The copper coffee pot that modern children carry today is a direct descendant of the medicine horn used in the trials. The birch twigs, the postgris, have an even darker history. Once used for Long Friday's flagellation and 19th century ritualized aggression, they are now decorated with soft feathers. We have taken the things that once terrified us, the flight to the Sabbath, the demonic familiar, the medicine horn, and we have handed them to our children as toys. We turn the massacre into a parade. But, for the historian, the mask of the 19th century is a reminder that the great noise never truly ended. It just changed its volume. The mockery of the 1800s was a bridge between the blood of the 1670s and the candy of the 2000s. It was a time when the world was still half dark, when the boundary between a prank and a curse was still dangerously thin. As the 20th century approached, the great noise was pushed further into the realm of whimsical folklore, and the Blue Maiden Island became a national park rather than a place of dread. But the inversion remains. We still celebrate the rebirth of spring by dressing as the figures of death and judgment. We still mark the holy day with the symbols of the unholy. As we move into the final part of our journey, we must look at the modern mask and the final revelation of the Sabbath. Keep the image of the soot-blackened youth in your mind. The transition from the hideous to the cute is perhaps the most frightening transformation of all. It is the moment a society decides to forget the blood and replace it with a whimsical lie. But the truth is still there, hidden in the copper pot and the birch twigs. The Sabbath is not a story for children. It is a record of a legal massacre. And as the modern Easter morning dawns, the shadow of the Blue Maiden still falls across the land, a cold blue reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is just wearing a different mask. The great noise never truly ended. It just changed its volume. It became the whisper of the wind through the birch twigs, the clink of a coin in a copper pot, and the secret names we are still afraid to speak. The sanitization of the 20th century was a social necessity, a way for a nation to move past a tragedy that claimed the lives of approximately 400 people. But in our rush to forget, we have lost the esoteric wisdom of the old world. We have replaced the shamanic flight with a walk to the neighbour's door. We have replaced the Blue Hill with a holiday card. The tradition of the Easter witch is not a celebration of folklore, it is a ritual of forgetting. By dressing our children as the very thing we once burned, we are performing a mass psychological exorcism every single year. We are saying to the ghosts of 1675, "Look, you are no longer a threat. You are a child. You are a toy." We have conquered the little master not through prayer, but through mockery and sweets. The great noise has been turned into the sweet exchange, a victory of the mundane over the spectral. But the Blue Hill is still there, rising from the mist of the Kalmar Strait. It is a place of 9,000 years of ritual, of shamanic flight and demonic feast. It is a place where the world once turned upside down, and it is a place that still demands the return of its stones. The Swedish Easter is a season of light, but that light is cast by the embers of the pyres. When you see the little witches on the street this year, remember the medicine horn and the great noise. Remember that the cute mask they wear is the only thing standing between us and the fire. The Sabbath is over, but the Blue Maiden is still waiting. The final revelation of Blå Jungfrun is that the spooky and the esoteric are not things that belong to the past. They are the permanent features of our landscape, the blue granite of our soul. We may paint our cheeks and carry our copper pots, but we are still the travellers of the liminal space. The flight to the Sabbath is a journey into the heart of what it means to be human. The desire to fly, the fear of the dark, and the desperate need to belong to something greater than ourselves. The great noise was a tragedy, but it was also a moment of absolute clarity. It was a time when the world was wide open, and the Blue Hill was just across the water. Easter in Sweden will always be a time of the backwards world, a time when we let the monsters into our homes and give them candy. It is a folklore survival that connects the modern suburbs to the iron-grey winds of the 17th century. The sanitized mask is the price we pay for our peace. But as the sun sets on another Easter Eve, the shadow of the Blue Maiden still falls across the land, a cold blue reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is just waiting for the next time the world turns upside down and the flight to the Sabbath begins again. The geography of the damned is still mapped in the marrow of our bones. The protocol of the Sabbath is still encoded in our decorations, and the great noise is still there, just beneath the surface of the whimsical Easter morning. We are the children of the Blue Hill, and the flight to Blå Jungfrun is a journey that defines us, whether we remember the name or not. For in the end, the Easter witches are not them. They are us, and the Sabbath is now.